Today, we are undertaking a really detailed examination of a case that absolutely horrified the nation.
We really did.
It sparked this intense debate about how we treat minors in the legal system, and I mean, it just laid bare this dangerous intersection of severe mental illness and, well, online fiction. We're focusing on the 2014 attempted murder in Waukesha, Wisconsin. You probably know it as the Slender Man stabbing.
And for this conversation, it's just so important to approach it with immense care and, nuance.
Absolutely.
What makes this Waukesha incident so uniquely tragic and just so profoundly disturbing is the age of everyone involved.
They were children.
All of them. The victim, Peyton Leutner, and the two perpetrators, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir, were all just 12 years old when this happened.
It's hard to even fathom.
It is. And before we get into any of the facts, we really have to just pause and acknowledge the continuing pain and the trauma that Peyton Leutner and her family have experienced. Their lives were, they were irrevocably changed. It's a story of immense suffering, but also ultimately of just remarkable resilience.
We absolutely have to keep that perspective right at the forefront of this whole conversation. So, okay, let's go directly to the initial facts. On May 31st, 2014, Peyton Leutner was lured into a densely wooded part of a local park.
And stabbed a staggering 19 times.
19 times. And when the authorities apprehended the girls, what was the explicit motive for this brutal, nearly fatal act?
The motive was derived entirely from their shared intense immersion in online horror fiction.
Specifically, Slender Man.
Specifically, the mythology of Slender Man. They confessed that they believed this murder was a necessary act, a sacrifice.
A sacrifice for what, exactly? What did they think it would accomplish?
They believed that by killing their friend, they would achieve two goals. First, they thought it would appease Slender Man, prevent him from harming them or their families.
And the second goal?
The second was to actually prove his existence to the world and to themselves, and maybe even become his proxies or his servants.
So they could go to his mansion?
That was the idea. To gain access to this imagined mansion. It
Yeah.
was, for them, an offering that was meant to bridge the gap between their fantasy world and our reality.
So that sets the context for our examination today.
Yeah.
We really need to dissect the timeline leading up to the attack, explore the truly complex legal tightrope that was walked here.
When you have severe mental illness intersecting with the severity of a crime like this committed by a minor, it's almost an impossible situation.
It is. And we need to trace the significant cultural and legal reverberations that this event has caused right up to the present day, because this case is, as we'll see, far from over.
Let's start by establishing the dynamic between the girls before this. This fiction became a shared, dangerous delusion. Our sources showed that Peyton Leutner, who went by the nickname Bella at the time, she and Morgan Geyser were, by all accounts, just typical childhood best friends.
They were close from a very early age. But the equilibrium of that friendship really changed when Anissa Weir entered the picture.
How so?
Well, Weir and Geyser, they bonded powerfully, not over typical school things, but because they lived in the same apartment building.
So proximity.
Proximity was a factor, but more importantly, they shared this consuming, intense interest in creepypasta.
For listeners who might not be deeply familiar, maybe we should just quickly define creepypasta in this context.
Sure. Creepypasta is essentially modern digital folklore. It's horror fiction that gets circulated widely on the internet, often anonymously, and it's presented as if it were true, like urban legends for the digital age.
Exactly. Ghost stories for the internet. And Slender Man is, without a doubt, the most famous example of this.
A tall, faceless man in a suit who stalks children.
Right. Stalks and abducts people, particularly children. And Weir and Geyser's shared interest in this, especially in Slender Man, it began around December of 2013, so about 6 months before the attack.
And here's the crucial part. The sources really highlight the fundamental difference in perspective held by the victim. Peyton Leutner did not share this interest at all.
No, not at all. In fact, she found the Slender Man character profoundly horrifying.
That contrast really is the fault line of this whole tragedy, isn't it?
It is. For Peyton, it was entertainment that scared her, like a scary movie. But for Geyser and Weir, that boundary between what's fiction and what's reality, it dissolved.
They truly believed he was a real physical entity.
They genuinely believed Slender Man was a corporeal being who would harm them, or worse, harm their families, if they failed to perform a significant act of devotion. And that act was the sacrifice of their friend. This wasn't just a fantasy. It was a shared delusion that escalated into a premeditated crime.
And this clearly was not a crime of passion. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst. The depth of the sources confirms they had been seriously contemplating this for months.
Oh, months.
What did their confessions reveal about the failed earlier attempts to carry out the murder?
Well, the initial planning shows this chilling persistence. They had multiple versions of the plan that failed simply because the opportunity wasn't right or because of their own apprehension at the last second.
Like what? What were some of the other plans?
They confessed to considering murdering Leutner while she was sleeping during the sleepover they held that weekend.
Which was the night before the attack.
The night before. They also considered trying to do it in a bathroom at a local public place. When those ideas didn't materialize, they finalized the plan for the next morning, choosing the hide-and-seek strategy in the park as the way they'd do it.
The fact that they discussed these options, abandoned them, and then just settled on a new method, it just demonstrates this meticulous, escalating commitment to violence.
It's a very clear indication of premeditation.
So that brings us to the morning of May 31st, 2014, in the heavily wooded Davids Park near Waukesha. How did they use an innocent game like hide-and-seek to isolate and ultimately pin down Peyton Leutner?
They leveraged the trust that existed between them. Leutner later recounted that once they were deep in the woods, Anissa Weir told her to lie down and cover herself with sticks and leaves.
Why? What was the reason they gave her?
Supposedly to achieve the perfect camouflage for the game. This was the trick, the mechanism they used to immobilize her, or at least distract her. And once she was on the ground and covered, they attacked.
And the attack itself was, the word savage comes to mind. It involved a 5-inch kitchen knife.
It did. They stabbed Peyton 19 times. Across her torso, her arms, her legs. The sheer brutality of it, especially when you remember these were 12-year-old girls, it's difficult to comprehend. The severity of her internal injuries immediately told investigators this was an attempt to kill, not just to harm.
The details surrounding her survival they're nothing short of miraculous, according to all the sources we reviewed. It really speaks to a razor-thin margin between life and death.
It was devastatingly close. Of the 19 wounds, one in particular was almost immediately fatal. It missed a major artery near her heart by less than 1 millimeter.
Less than a millimeter.
Another stab wound perforated her diaphragm and caused extensive damage to her liver and her stomach. She needed 6 hours of emergency surgery to repair the arteries and the tissue damage.
There was a quote from the surgeon, Dr. John Kellerman, that really captures it.
Yes. He later made a statement that truly frames the near-fatal nature of the attack. He said, and I'm quoting here, "If the knife had gone the width of a human hair further, she wouldn't have lived."
The width of a human hair, that gives you such a visceral understanding of the violence she endured. What did Geyser and Weir do immediately after the attack?
After the stabbing, they told Peyton that they would go find help.
Which was a lie.
It was a complete lie. They abandoned her there in the woods. And this is another one of those crucial details that shows how severe their delusion was. It just completely overrode any sense of compassion or even self-preservation. They were focused entirely on their mission.
To find the Slender Mansion.
Exactly.
But Peyton Leutner, despite these horrific injuries, she performed an incredible act of self-rescue.
Absolutely. Her survival depended entirely on her own determination. Bleeding profusely, in agonizing pain, she managed to drag herself out of the dense woods and onto a bike path near the road.
And that's where she was found.
That's where a passing cyclist discovered her and immediately called 911. She spent 7 days in the hospital recovering from critical injuries, but thanks to that immediate medical intervention and just her own will to live, she was able to return to school that very September.
An absolutely incredible story of survival. The capture itself was swift. It happened just 5 hours later, about 5 miles from the crime scene.
And they were still carrying the knife, the 5-inch knife.
When they were questioned, their motive was immediately confirmed, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. When police apprehended them, they just told the officers flat out that they were walking to the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest.
Which is, what, 200 miles away?
About 200 miles away. They said that's where they believed they would find Slender Man's home, the Slender Mansion. Their commitment to this fantasy was absolute, even as they were being detained.
And the initial interrogations, that's where the psychological profiles of the two girls really started to diverge, even though they shared the same fundamental delusion. What kind of picture did the investigators report?
The sources show a very stark contrast. Morgan Geyser, who did the actual stabbing, she showed a profound lack of emotional response. No empathy during her questioning. She just seemed detached, almost concerned only with whether the sacrifice was effective.
And Anissa Weir?
Anissa Weir, on the other hand, while she was still maintaining that the act was necessary, she displayed visible guilt, remorse. You could see she was distressed over what they had done. And this initial difference really hints at the deeper psychiatric issues that would soon be uncovered, particularly for Morgan Geyser.
And this leads us right into the heart of the case's complexity, Geyser's severe underlying mental illness. Before the attack, what kind of indicators of psychosis had already shown up in her life?
The pretrial psychiatric evaluations uncovered a history of severe symptoms going all the way back to her early childhood. This was not a sudden break from reality that was caused by some internet story.
This was something much deeper.
Much deeper. It was a profound, lifelong disorder that was being exacerbated by the Slender Man obsession. Geyser disclosed a history of chronic visual and auditory hallucinations.
What sort of things did she report seeing and hearing?
Things like figures she believed were ghosts, seeing colors literally melting down the walls, and conversing with two long-standing imaginary friends she called Maggie and Sev.
And the hallucinations became progressively more sinister as she got older, right?
Exactly. She reported this recurrent hallucination of a shadowy figure, she called it, which she described as being the color of smoke and ink.
That's terrifying.
She claimed to see it standing silently behind her in mirrors or shifting around corners. And this is a critical point. While Slender Man provided the narrative, the script for her violence, these pre-existing, non-specific psychotic symptoms, they indicated a much deeper underlying condition.
So what happened immediately after her arrest as the system was trying to figure out her fitness to stand trial?
Her mental state just deteriorated rapidly. Her mother, Angie Geyser, later described her post-arrest behavior as floridly psychotic.
What does that mean in practical terms? What was she doing?
Correctional officers detailed highly erratic actions in detention. Geyser was frequently reported talking to herself, engaging in these bizarre, regressive behaviors like pretending to be a cat.
Oh, cat.
Yes, or attempting to keep ants as pets, and holding these extended, intense conversations with multiple fictional characters, not just Slender Man, but also Severus Snape from Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort.
This extreme presentation, that's what led to the definitive diagnosis.
It did. In October 2014, just a few months after the attack, Morgan Geyser received the diagnosis that shaped her entire legal path: early onset childhood schizophrenia.
And that's a particularly rare and severe condition when it manifests so young.
Extremely. It signals a profoundly disrupted ability to process reality.
The sources, though, they indicate a critical failing in her subsequent treatment, which created a significant delay in actually addressing her psychosis.
This is maybe the most damning indictment of the initial system response. For the first 20 months after her diagnosis, Geyser's treatment was described as alarmingly erratic and inadequate.
Why was that?
She was cycling in and out of acute psychosis because she was not being kept on a consistent regimen of antipsychotic medication.
Yeah.
And this period of inadequate treatment, it just significantly exacerbated her symptoms and ensured she remained completely unable to recognize the severity and reality of her crime.
So when did that crucial change in her treatment finally happen, and what was the effect?
It wasn't until November 2015, a full year and a half after the stabbing, that Geyser finally began a consistent long-term course of antipsychotic medication.
And the change was significant.
The change was profound. Once the medication stabilized her brain chemistry, her capacity for critical thought returned. By March of 2016, she finally reached a level of stability where she could look back at what happened in 2014, understand that the Slender Man belief was a delusion driven by her illness, and for the very first time, show genuine guilt, remorse, and an understanding of the gravity of what she had done.
That timeline is just so essential. The legal process was dealing with an acutely psychotic, unmedicated child for a year and a half, which of course leads directly to the massive legal challenge here, prosecuting 12-year-olds for an attempted murder of this severity.
Exactly. The charges were exceptionally serious. Geyser was facing attempted first-degree intentional homicide, a Class A felony. Weir was facing attempted second-degree intentional homicide, a Class B felony.
And given the egregious nature of the attack, the prosecutor immediately pursued a very contentious legal maneuver.
He did. He moved to waive them out of juvenile court and try them as adults.
So what were the legal ramifications of trying children as adults in this particular case?
Well, the decision was highly controversial because it meant they were facing adult sentences, potentially decades in prison, rather than just being treated and released when they turned 18, which is what's typical in the juvenile system.
But the legal argument was that the crime was just too severe.
The legal argument centered on the severity of the premeditation and the violence itself, which Wisconsin law allows as a justification for that waiver.
The ultimate verdict for both girls, though, it hinged on their mental states. They were found not guilty by mental disease or defect in 2017. Can you just quickly explain to listeners what that verdict means in practical terms? Because it doesn't mean they walked free.
Absolutely not. This verdict is a finding that while they committed the criminal act, they were incapable of appreciating the wrongfulness of their actions because of a severe mental defect or disease at the time of the crime. The public often confuses this with an acquittal.
But it's not.
It's not. In reality, it mandates a commitment to a state forensic psychiatric institution for long-term involuntary treatment, sometimes for a term that's potentially longer than a prison sentence would have been.
And before that final verdict, there was a major legal argument raised about Geiser's initial statements to the police, centering on her Miranda rights.
Yes, this was a cornerstone of Geiser's appeals for years. Her defense argued that her statements during that first interrogation should have been suppressed.
On what grounds?
On the grounds that, given her state of active florid psychosis at age 12, she lacked the legal competency to knowingly and intelligently waive her Miranda rights, her right to remain silent, and her right to a lawyer.
The argument being that a child who is actively conversing with fictional characters and believes Slender Man is real couldn't possibly understand the weight of that process.
Exactly. How could she? That was the argument.
And what was the outcome of that appeal?
Ultimately, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected those arguments in 2021. The court found that while she was clearly delusional, she was capable of understanding the basic legal concepts that were presented to her by the officers at the time, which meant her waiver was considered legally valid. And that decision really underscored the immense challenge the legal system faces when it tries to balance constitutional rights against the acute mental incapacity of a minor.
So the verdict led to these indeterminate commitments to state psychiatric facilities. How did the lengths of those commitments differ for Anissa Weir and Morgan Geiser?
The duration really reflected the severity of their involvement and their underlying conditions. Anissa Weir received a sentence of 25 years to life.
Meaning she would be confined and treated under supervision until she was 37.
Correct, until she reached the age of 37. Morgan Geiser, on the other hand, because of the classification of her primary charge, that first-degree intentional homicide, and the severity of her early-onset schizophrenia, she received the maximum sentence, 40 years to life.
So her commitment was indefinite.
Indefinite, until her symptoms were deemed fully resolved and stable, or until she reached the age of 53.
Weir, having pleaded guilty and showing remorse much earlier, was the first to pursue release. Her petition came in 2021, 7 years after the attack.
Yes. In March of 2021, Weir, who was 19 years old by then, she demonstrated really significant progress in her therapeutic process. She submitted a deeply reflective letter to the court.
What did it say?
She extended a profound apology for the agony, pain, and fear she had caused Peyton Leutner and her community. But crucially, she articulated this key psychological breakthrough. She said that while she remains sorry for her actions, she has moved past hating herself for them.
Which is a huge marker of therapeutic success.
A huge marker. It indicates effective cognitive restructuring and self-acceptance.
So what were the final conditions of her release, which happened in September 2021? They were incredibly stringent.
They were. And they were designed to ensure public safety and Weir's continued stability. She was placed on supervised release until 2039.
And the stipulations?
They included mandatory residence with her father, adherence to a strict regimen of psychiatric medication and counseling, and highly restrictive digital rules.
Meaning her internet use is monitored.
Limited and monitored, and she is banned entirely from all social media platforms. Initially, she was also required to wear a 24-hour GPS ankle monitor.
But that requirement was eventually removed, wasn't it?
It was, in September of 2023, signaling that the authorities had confidence in her stability at that time.
And what was the Leutner family's public reaction to Anissa Weir's release?
The sources say that while the Leutner family publicly stated they felt reasonably comfortable with the extreme level of monitoring and the strict rules imposed on Weir, they still wished she had been required to serve a longer period of confinement.
Which is completely understandable.
Completely. It reflects the magnitude of the trauma they endured.
Okay, turning now to Morgan Geiser. Her path to conditional release has been considerably longer and much more fraught with complications, largely because of the severity of her condition. She waited much longer to petition for release.
She did. Her legal team spent years exhausting all the appeals about her adult status and the Miranda ruling. She finally filed a petition for conditional release in January of 2024, 2 years after she withdrew an earlier attempt. And that initial 2024 request was denied by the court.
But she found success on appeal in January 2025. What was the rationale for allowing her release at that point?
The experts testified that after years of consistent, successful antipsychotic medication, Geyser had made considerable progress in stabilizing her schizophrenia and addressing her past delusions. They felt she had reached a point where the benefit of transitioning to a less restrictive, supervised environment outweighed the risk.
Provided the supervision was robust.
Exactly, as long as it was robust.
It was also during this period, in January 2025, that Geyser made a significant personal transition.
Yes, she began identifying publicly as a transgender male and initiated a social transition using male pronouns. It is important, though, for you to understand this fact in the context of the official documentation.
What do you mean?
Despite this personal declaration, court officials and most legal documents related to her ongoing supervision and release, they continued to use female pronouns. So that's something we have to note when we're discussing the public record.
Her conditional release plan, however, almost immediately ran into serious trouble in February and March of 2025. This stemmed from reports of her behavior inside the facility. What were the nature of those allegations?
These were highly alarming allegations. They caused the release plan hearing to be temporarily canceled. Reports surfaced detailing violent communication Geyser was allegedly having with a man outside the facility.
And there was more.
Yes. She was also found to be reading material that included specific references to sexual sadism and murder. And these details, naturally, raised massive concerns about whether her progress was genuine or just superficial.
If these allegations were true, how could the psychiatric team still maintain that she was stable enough for release?
This is a point of real friction in the sources. The 3 doctors who had previously evaluated her were brought back in to testify specifically on this issue, and they acknowledged the reading material was inappropriate and the communication was concerning.
But they didn't think it was a deal breaker.
They testified that these incidents, while they were concerning in terms of her judgment, did not indicate a relapse into active psychosis or a return of the Slender Man delusions. Their professional opinion was that she remained stable on her medication and was still suitable for conditional release, and the judge allowed the plan to move forward in March 2025.
The final release plan was approved in July 2025 when Geyser was 22. What was the nature of her supervision?
She was approved to leave the psychiatric hospital and live in a state-monitored group home. Her supervision period is significantly longer than Weir's. It lasts until 2058.
That long supervision term ensures that even if she remains stable, the state maintains control over her residence, her employment, her medication for decades.
For decades.
However, actually implementing that plan proved to be exceptionally difficult, mainly due to resistance in the community about where she should live.
Absolutely. The placement difficulties really highlight this conflict between rehabilitation goals and public safety concerns, and especially the safety of the victim. The first attempt to place her in a Milwaukee group home was denied specifically because it was deemed too close to where Peyton Leutner lives.
Which illustrates the court's obligation to minimize the risk of an accidental encounter and to protect the victim's right to security.
Exactly.
And there was another rejection after that, too.
Yes, a second group home in Manitowoc rejected her placement. The reasons they cited were twofold. The facility itself was deemed too isolated, which could compromise the intense supervision required. And the existing residents in the group home complex expressed deep unhappiness and fear about having such a high-profile, violent offender placed among them.
Despite all these hurdles, her attorney reported she was staying stable.
Consistently reported that Geyser herself maintained an emotionally stable and positive attitude throughout this whole protracted process.
And this brings us to the crucial, recent development that occurred just this month, throwing the whole story into chaos.
On the evening of November 22, 2025, Morgan Geyser cut off her Department of Corrections monitoring bracelet. She then left the group home she was finally placed in, which was located in Madison, Wisconsin.
And she wasn't alone.
The Madison Police Department confirmed she was last seen around 8 p.m. with an adult acquaintance. As of this discussion, her current whereabouts remain unknown, and there is an ongoing search.
This event is just a dramatic failure of the conditional release system.
It is, and it highlights the systemic difficulties in managing and monitoring individuals who, despite years of treatment, have a history of severe violence that stems from psychosis.
The public reaction to this latest development has been, as you'd expect, incredibly intense.
Well, it creates enormous stress for the victim's family, and it prompts these critical questions about the level of surveillance provided by the Department of Corrections. It instantly reintroduces the terror and the anxiety the community felt back in 2014.
And it forces society to reckon with a very stark reality.
It does. The reality that rehabilitation, especially for severe mental illness that led to violence, is a fragile, ongoing process. It's not a guaranteed endpoint.
We absolutely must now reflect on the aftermath, and we have to begin with Peyton Leutner, who showed such incredible fortitude by returning to school just months after sustaining 19 stab wounds.
Her physical recovery was remarkable, but the psychological toll remains profound and lasting. In 2019, years after the attack, Leutner revealed a truly heart-wrenching detail of her lingering trauma.
What was that?
She sleeps with broken scissors under her pillow, a desperate attempt to create a weapon in case she's attacked again. And that single anecdote just powerfully conveys how deeply the fear of recurrence is embedded in her daily life.
Yet, despite that crippling trauma, Leutner gave a public statement in 2019 that was. It was maybe the most surprising revelation of the entire case.
She sat for an interview with ABC's 2020, speaking for the first time about the incident. And while she acknowledged her physical scars, she expressed this surprisingly detached view of them, saying they would probably fade eventually.
But the truly shocking part of the interview came when she was asked what she would say to Morgan Geyser if she ever saw her again.
Yes. Her response was that she would thank her.
Thank her.
She said she would thank Geyser because the attack, paradoxically, inspired her to dedicate her life to medicine. She's now focused on her ambition to become a nurse, using her own trauma as a motivating force to help other people.
That is an incredibly rare, almost impossible psychological coping mechanism.
To reframe the source of your deepest pain into the foundation of your life's purpose, her stated goal now is simply to move past the whole incident and live her life as normally as possible.
Beyond the individuals involved, this case created a profound ripple effect across the country, sparking what our sources describe as a national moral panic centered on the potential dangers of the internet for children.
The reaction from law enforcement and from parents was immediate, and it was fearful. The Waukesha police chief, Russell P. Jack, he described the stabbing not just as a tragedy, but as a wake-up call for all parents about online consumption.
He issued a stern public warning.
He did, acknowledging the internet's educational potential, but stressing that it is simultaneously full of dark and wicked things.
And this concern was amplified by experts in law enforcement, who essentially argued that the internet creates a toxic environment for vulnerable youth.
Retired FBI agent John Egelhoff argued that the internet exposes children to a more sinister world, and he called it a sort of black hole of negative influence if it's unsupervised. He strongly urged constant vigilant parental monitoring of children's online use.
But the societal debate wasn't one-sided. Others pushed back against this idea of a moral panic.
Exactly. Academics like Assistant Professor Shira Chess countered that creepypasta is simply a modern form of horror storytelling. No more inherently dangerous than stories about traditional monsters like vampires or zombies.
The argument being that the online creative communities around these stories can actually be a positive outlet.
A platform for aspiring writers and storytellers? They argued the core issue wasn't the fiction itself, but the pre-existing pathology of the perpetrators.
The source material is very clear on one thing, though. Regardless of the debate over its inherent danger, the Waukesha stabbing irreversibly altered the cultural perception of the Slender Man legend.
It shifted the legend dramatically. Before 2014, Slender Man was a fun, frightening meme, a piece of internet folklore. After 2014, the character became inextricably linked with real-world violence. It lent the digital mythology a tangible, horrifying gravity it had never had before,
Which led to parents nationwide becoming gripped by fear.
over the potential harm these stories pose to their children.
Yes. So how did the creepypasta community, the very creators and curators of this lore, how do they respond to the attack?
Well, they were immediately forced into a defensive posture. The Creepypasta Wiki, which is the central hub for the lore, was temporarily blocked throughout the entire Waukesha school district. Eric Knudsen, the original creator of Slender Man, released a statement of condolence expressing profound sadness.
But their response went beyond just sympathy. They vigorously defended the nature of horror fiction itself.
They did. They stressed that the attack was an isolated incident rooted in mental illness. not a general representation of their community. A former wiki administrator stated unequivocally that the creepypasta wiki is purely a literary website, and its members do not condone murder or real-world violence.
They released an official statement.
An official statement asserting that blaming only horror writing for a tragedy like this is off the mark, and that the deep pathology of the children was the true catalyst.
And the community also took tangible, positive action to counter the negative association.
They did. They organized a 24-hour live stream on YouTube specifically to raise money for Peyton Leutner. They explicitly stated their goal was to show that the community cared for the victim and did not support violence.
And that was separate from a massive local effort in Madison.
Completely separate. That saw a one-day bratwurst festival run by over 250 volunteers raise more than $70,000 for Leutner's medical costs.
Unfortunately, the sources also detail other incidents that authorities in different jurisdictions then linked, however tenuously, to Slender Man in the immediate aftermath.
Yes, there were several concerning reports. In June 2014, shortly after the attack, an unnamed woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, reported that her 13-year-old daughter had attacked her with a knife. The mother told reporters that the daughter had been writing macabre fiction that sometimes referenced Slender Man.
And there was an arson case in Florida.
In September 2014, a 14-year-old girl in Port Richey, Florida, allegedly set her family's house on fire while her mother and younger brother were inside. The police investigation revealed she'd been consuming Slender Man stories online, along with a violent manga called Soul Eater.
And the local sheriff's office saw a connection.
They noted that it would be safe to say there is a connection between her actions and the dark content she was consuming.
One of the most fascinating aspects of this cultural echo, though, involved the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, where Slender Man lore intersected with deeply traditional beliefs.
This represents a really unique cultural synthesis. In early 2015, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation experienced a tragic epidemic of youth suicide attempts, and tribal officials cited Slender Man as an influencing factor among some of the young people.
How so? How did that connection get made?
The Oglala Sioux tribe president connected the modern Slender Man icon to a traditional Native American belief in a suicide spirit, or the big man, a tall, malevolent figure associated with death. It suggested this cultural remix, where the potent, modern icon of Slender Man, introduced via social media, fused seamlessly with an established, dark, traditional myth that was already present in the community's folklore, and that intensified its impact.
Finally, we should discuss the ethical controversy around the exploitation of this tragedy in pop culture, specifically the 2018 Slender Man film.
The announcement and release of that film generated immediate, widespread public backlash. Bill Weir, Anissa Weir's father, he publicly condemned the film, stating it was extremely distasteful and arguing that capitalizing on the events would only extend the pain all three of these families have gone through.
An advocacy group even organized a petition against it.
Yes, Care too. They labeled the film crass commercialism at its worst.
And the opposition was strong enough that it had real commercial consequences.
It did. Marcus Theaters, a major chain, announced they would refuse to screen the film in Milwaukee and Waukesha counties out of respect for the victims and the community's trauma. And even though Sony tried to maintain the film, was based only on the general online popularity of the character, not the specific stabbing.
The controversy forced their hand.
It did. Reports indicated that out of fear of public backlash, the studio required the producers to meet a PG-13 rating, which resulted in them hurriedly cutting several scenes, and that ultimately led to noticeable continuity issues in the final theatrical release.
The source material also lists several other inspired media that drew from this tragic case.
The incident proved to be fertile, though very controversial, ground for other media narratives. This includes the acclaimed 2016 HBO documentary Beware the Slender Man, which provided a crucial initial look into the girl's psychological states, and it also inspired several TV episodes like Law & Order, SVU's Glasgowman's Wrath and Criminal Minds' The Tall Man, and even fictional horror movies like Terror in the Woods and Mercy Black.
Reviewing this entire harrowing story, from the moment of the attack to the massive legal battles and, of course, the recent escape, what are the key findings we really have to synthesize for everyone listening?
Well, what stands out is this complex interplay of severe factors. First, you have the catastrophic presence of undiagnosed, untreated, early-onset childhood schizophrenia in Morgan Geyser. That rendered her incapable of discerning fantasy from reality.
That's the foundation.
That's the foundation. Second, you have the unique power of 21st century online fiction of creepypasta to be internalized as genuine ideology by children who are isolated or mentally vulnerable. And third, the immense strain that was placed on the judicial and psychiatric systems, which struggled for years to reconcile the demands of justice and public safety with the need for specialized rehabilitation.
For defendants who were, fundamentally, children suffering from severe psychosis. And the recent news of Morgan Geyser's escape from the group home in November 2025, it just emphasizes that this case is still evolving and that the complexities of rehabilitation are far from resolved, even after more than a decade.
It absolutely underscores the fragility of the entire system. You have years of consistent, successful treatment in a high-security, controlled environment that led to stability. But the transition to conditional community release, which is intended to test that stability, it immediately introduced variables.
Proximity issues, community pressure, the personal stress of limited freedom.
All of it. And it ultimately resulted in the system failing to contain her. It raises these difficult questions about whether certain severe mental illnesses, especially those that fueled premeditated violence, can ever truly be safely managed outside of institutional settings.
As we conclude our exploration of this complex tragedy, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought. It's drawn from the cultural analysis of the Slender Man myth itself. The sources note a definite trend in the years following the Waukesha stabbing.
Yes, there has been a distinct shift in the mythology that's being created online. Many new portrayals of Slender Man now show him in a far more benevolent light.
How so?
He often acts as an anti-hero who specifically protects victimized children, sometimes using violent means against bullies or abusers. A professor of folklore observed this change began shortly after the 2014 stabbing.
So here's the question for you to consider as you reflect on this case. Is this cultural movement toward a kinder, anti-heroic Slender Man a genuine natural evolution of modern folklore? A reflection of how digital myths adapt and change over time?
Or is it perhaps a reactive, defensive mechanism employed by the online creative community? A deliberate effort to sanitize the mythology and actively distance the character from the horrific, real-world violence it so tragically inspired in 2014.
That tension between organic myth-making and conscious cultural damage control is something truly worth mulling over.
It is.
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth conversation.
Thanks for listening.